Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The winter of 1895 had descended upon London with a severity that transformed the great metropolis into a crystalline wonderland of treacherous beauty. Snow fell in thick curtains for 3 consecutive days, muffling the usual cacophony of horse-drawn traffic and street vendors, while coating the familiar thoroughfares in a pristine white that reflected the pale glow of gas lamps like scattered diamonds. From our comfortable lodgings at 221B Baker Street, I observed the city's transformation with that mixture of appreciation and trepidation that such weather invariably inspired in those of us who valued both beauty and practicality. My friend Sherlock Holmes had been in one of his restless moods throughout this enforced indoor confinement, pacing our sitting room like a caged panther and complaining bitterly about the tedium of London's criminal element during the winter months. He stood now at our frost-edged window, his aquiline profile silhouetted against the grey morning light, watching the steady procession of bundled figures navigating the treacherous streets below. "Observe, Watson," he said suddenly without turning from his vigil. "The gentleman in the brown overcoat who has just passed beneath our window for the 3rd time in as many minutes." I joined him at the window and spotted the figure in question, a portly man who appeared to be examining the brass nameplate of each building with unusual intensity. "He carries himself with the bearing of officialdom," Holmes continued. "Yet his coat, while well made, shows signs of hasty dressing. Note how the left shoulder sits slightly higher than the right, suggesting he thrust his arm through the sleeve with some urgency. His boots, though polished, bear fresh scratches from navigating icy cobblestones at speed rather than with the measured pace of routine patrol. Most tellingly, he glances repeatedly at a slip of paper in his gloved hand, clearly seeking a specific address in an area with which he is unfamiliar." Before I could respond to this typical display of my friend's observational prowess, the sound of rapid footsteps upon our stair announced the arrival of a visitor. Mrs. Hudson's knock was followed immediately by the entrance of Inspector Lestrade, his usually immaculate appearance somewhat dishevelled by his hurried journey through the snow-laden streets. "Holmes!" he exclaimed, without preamble, his breath forming small clouds in the chilled air that had crept through our window frames. "I've encountered something that defies all reasonable explanation, a case so peculiar that even my most experienced constables are completely baffled." Holmes turned from the window with the fluid grace of a predator sensing prey, his grey eyes immediately sharpening with interest. "Ah, Lestrade, I trust your urgent errand concerns something more stimulating than the usual domestic disputes and petty thefts that seem to proliferate during these frozen months." "Indeed it does," the inspector replied, accepting the chair I offered beside our fireplace. "It concerns the residence of Sir Reginald Ashworth in Belgravia. You may know him as one of London's most prominent antiquities dealers, with considerable influence in both government and academic circles." Holmes settled into his own chair, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin in that characteristic pose I had observed countless times when his interest was thoroughly engaged. "Continue, Inspector. I find myself curious about any matter that could so thoroughly perplex the official mind." Lestrade leaned forward, his expression grave. 3 days ago, during the height of the snowstorm, Sir Reginald discovered that his most prized possession, a magnificent sapphire ring known as the Star of Kashmir, had vanished from his private study. The ring, worth considerably more than most men earn in a lifetime, had been secured in a locked drawer within his desk, a drawer to which only he possessed the key. "A straightforward case of theft, one might assume," Holmes observed, though I detected the faintest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yet something tells me the matter is not quite so simple." "Far from it," Lestrade continued. Sir Reginald's study showed no signs of forced entry. The windows were securely latched from within, the door had been locked, and no member of his household staff could account for the ring's disappearance. We conducted a thorough investigation, questioning everyone from the butler to the scullery maid, but found nothing to suggest how the theft might have been accomplished. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing before the fireplace. And yet you mentioned that the case defies explanation. Surely a locked room theft, while challenging, is not entirely unprecedented. That's just it, Holmes. The ring has been found. My friend ceased his pacing abruptly. Indeed? And where, pray tell, did this miraculous recovery occur? Lestrade's voice dropped to an almost incredulous whisper. Inside a snowman, Holmes. A child's snowman in the garden of a boarding house in Whitechapel, nearly 3 miles from Sir Reginald's residence. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of our fire and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Holmes stood perfectly motionless for several moments, his brilliant mind undoubtedly working through the logical possibilities and impossibilities presented by this extraordinary revelation. Fascinating, he murmured finally. And what is the precise timeline of these remarkable events? Sir Reginald last saw the ring in his study on the evening of January 10th, when he showed it to a visiting colleague. The theft was discovered on the morning of January the 12th. The snowman was built by the children of Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house on the afternoon of January 11th, and the ring was discovered within it yesterday morning when the structure began to collapse due to the rising temperature. Holmes's eyes gleamed with the particular intensity that indicated a puzzle worthy of his attention, and the children's explanation for this remarkable circumstance. They swear they built the snowman using only snow from their own small garden, and that they placed nothing inside it save for the traditional stones and twigs used for decoration. The ring was discovered embedded in the creature's chest, wrapped in a silk handkerchief bearing Sir Reginald's monogram. Capital! Holmes exclaimed, his earlier restlessness replaced by the focused energy that always accompanied a truly intriguing case. Inspector, when may Watson and I examine the scene of this impossible mystery? Sir Reginald is expecting us within the hour, Lestrade replied, his relief evident. He's most anxious to have this matter resolved quickly and quietly, given the potential for scandal should word of these bizarre circumstances become public knowledge. As we prepared to venture into the frozen streets of London, I found myself contemplating the seemingly impossible elements of the case. How could a valuable ring disappear from a locked study, only to reappear inside a child's snowman miles away? What sequence of events could account for such an extraordinary occurrence? Holmes, adjusting his heavy ulster and selecting his walking stick with characteristic precision, seemed to read my thoughts. "Come, Watson," he said with evident satisfaction, his eyes bright with the thrill of intellectual challenge. "We're about to investigate a mystery that promises to test the very boundaries of logical deduction. The game, as they say, is afoot." The winter wind howled through the streets as our hansom cab carried us toward Belgravia, the horses' hooves ringing sharply against the ice-covered cobblestones. Whatever strange forces had orchestrated this impossible crime, I knew that my friend's unparalleled powers of observation and reasoning would soon illuminate the truth hidden within this bewildering puzzle. The frozen landscape of London stretched before us, harbouring secrets that only the most brilliant of minds could hope to unravel. The journey through London's snow-laden streets provided Holmes with an ideal opportunity to extract additional details from Inspector Lestrade, whose earlier account had raised as many questions as it had answered. As our hansom navigated the treacherous cobblestones, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against ice created a steady percussion that seemed to focus my friend's already formidable powers of concentration. The silk handkerchief bearing Sir Reginald's monogram, Holmes began, his penetrating gaze fixed upon the inspector despite the swaying motion of our conveyance. Was it one that he immediately recognized as his own property? Without question, Lestrade replied, consulting his leather-bound notebook with practiced efficiency. Sir Reginald confirmed it was from a set he had commissioned from Harrods. Only last month. The monogram work was executed in a distinctive gold thread pattern that he had specifically requested, quite unmistakable, according to him. Holmes leaned back against the worn leather seat, his long fingers drumming silently against his knee in that characteristic gesture I had learned to associate with intense mental calculation. Most illuminating, and the condition of this handkerchief when discovered within the Snowman? Remarkably well preserved, considering its extraordinary circumstances. The silk showed no signs of deterioration, though it was naturally damp from its icy surroundings. "Excellent," Holmes murmured, his eyes brightening with that particular intensity that indicated significant deductions were forming. "Tell me, Inspector, what was the precise weather pattern during the critical period?" The snowstorm began in earnest on the evening of January 10th and continued without significant interruption until the afternoon of January 12th. The temperature remained consistently below freezing throughout, with no thaw until yesterday morning when the Snowman began to collapse. Our cab drew to a halt before an imposing Georgian townhouse whose elegant facade spoke eloquently of considerable wealth and refined taste. The snow had been meticulously cleared from the front steps and walkway, revealing the attention to detail that characterized the residences of London's most prosperous citizens. As we alighted, I observed Holmes cataloguing every aspect of the building's exterior with his customary thoroughness. Sir Reginald Ashworth himself greeted us at the door, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 60 years, whose bearing suggested both scholarly pursuits and considerable worldly experience. His silver hair was immaculately groomed despite the early hour, and his clothing reflected the understated elegance favoured by those whose wealth required no ostentatious display. Yet I detected in his manner a nervous energy that suggested recent events had shaken his customary composure more than he cared to admit. "Mr. Holmes," he said, extending his hand with evident relief, "Inspector Lestrade has spoken most highly of your remarkable abilities. I confess that this entire affair has left me quite bewildered. Nothing in my 40 years of dealing with valuable antiquities has prepared me for such extraordinary circumstances. We were conducted through a series of elegantly appointed rooms that displayed Sir Reginald's expertise as a collector of rare and beautiful objects. Ancient vases, medieval manuscripts, and exquisite jewellery were arranged with the practised eye of one who understood both their historical significance and aesthetic value. The study itself proved to be a sanctuary of scholarly pursuit, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes and glass cases containing artifacts that spoke of civilizations long vanished. Sir Reginald directed our attention to a mahogany desk of exceptional craftsmanship. "The Star of Kashmir was kept in this drawer," he explained, indicating a locked compartment on the desk's right side. "I am the sole possessor of the key, which I keep upon my person at all times." Holmes examined the drawer with meticulous care, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to casual observation. After several moments of intense scrutiny, he straightened with a thoughtful expression. "The lock mechanism appears undamaged," he announced, "yet I observe minute scratches around the keyhole. Fresh ones, barely visible to the naked eye." Moving to the nearby window, Holmes inspected the latch mechanism with equal attention. These French windows, they provide access to the garden? Indeed, Sir Reginald confirmed, though they remained securely fastened throughout the period in question. Holmes nodded absently, his attention now drawn to a small writing table positioned near the window. Upon its surface lay a shallow tray containing what appeared to be fine, glittering powder. He lifted a pinch between his fingers, examining it closely before bringing it to his nose. "Pumice," he observed quietly, "suitable for polishing delicate surfaces or preparing vellum for writing." Sir Reginald observed Holmes's meticulous examination with growing fascination. "The pumice serves a very specific purpose in my manuscript restoration work," he explained, his scholarly enthusiasm momentarily overriding his anxiety about the theft. "I was preparing several pages of a 15th century Byzantine codex that evening. The powder removes surface imperfections from ancient vellum, allowing for proper ink adhesion during restoration." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved to examine the locked drawer more closely. Producing his magnifying glass, he scrutinized not only the exterior mechanism, but inserted his penknife delicately along the drawer's edges. After several moments of intense concentration, he withdrew the blade, revealing a minute fleck of blue material adhering to its tip. "Most illuminating," he murmured, holding the specimen up to the light streaming through the frost-covered windows. "Sealing wax, Sir Reginald, and recently softened, I would venture. Inspector Lestrade, would you be so kind as to examine the interior of this lock mechanism?" Lestrade peered through Holmes's magnifying glass as directed. "There appears to be some sort of powdery residue within the keyway itself." "Precisely," Holmes confirmed. "Pumice powder, unless I am much mistaken, the same substance we observed upon the writing table. Most curious that such material should find its way into a lock that, according to our host, is opened only with his personal key." Sir Reginald's complexion grew noticeably paler. "I cannot account for such a thing, Mr. Holmes. The key never leaves my watch chain, and I am most particular about securing my valuables." Holmes moved to a mahogany cabinet positioned near the window, opening it to reveal a neat arrangement of silk handkerchiefs, each bearing Sir Reginald's distinctive monogram in gold thread. His long fingers counted silently, his lips moving with mathematical precision. "Interesting. Your collection appears to be one handkerchief short of a complete set." "I had not noticed," Sir Reginald admitted, his voice betraying increasing distress. "Though I suppose it's possible that one might have been sent to the laundry or misplaced." "Or removed by someone who required it for a very specific purpose," Holmes observed quietly. Moving to examine the Persian carpet beneath the desk, he dropped to one knee, his keen eyes scanning the intricate patterns. "Watson, your medical training has given you an excellent eye for detail. What do you observe about the carpet's condition in this particular area?" I knelt beside my friend, studying the rich fabric carefully. After a moment, I detected what had caught his attention. "There are faint impressions here, as though someone with damp footwear had stood repeatedly in this spot. The carpet fibers show signs of having been compressed while wet." "Excellent observation," Holmes commended. "Note also the crystalline residue where the moisture has dried, street salt characteristic of London's winter pavements. Yet observe that no such traces appear near the French windows, suggesting our mysterious visitor entered through the house proper rather than from the garden." Inspector Lestrade consulted his notebook with renewed interest. "But Sir Reginald's staff all insist the study remained locked throughout the relevant period." Holmes rose gracefully, brushing an invisible speck from his trousers. "Indeed, Inspector. yet the physical evidence suggests otherwise. Sir Reginald, I believe you mentioned employing a secretary for your scholarly correspondence? Yes, Miss Clara Pemberton, a most capable young woman who assists with my research twice weekly. She has access to the study during her appointed hours, naturally, though always under my supervision. Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with unmistakable interest. Pemberton, you say? And might this young lady have any familial connections in the Whitechapel area? Sir Reginald appeared puzzled by the question's apparent irrelevance. I believe her mother operates a boarding house in that district, though Miss Pemberton herself maintains lodgings in Bloomsbury for convenience. She is most punctual and professional in her duties. When did Miss Pemberton last attend to her secretarial duties? Holmes inquired, his tone suggesting the answer held considerable significance. She was here on the afternoon of January 11th copying my notes on the Byzantine Codex restoration. She departed around 4 o'clock to catch an omnibus. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Lestrade. Most instructive. Inspector, I believe our investigation must now expand beyond the confines of this elegant study. The peculiar circumstances surrounding the Star of Kashmir's reappearance in a Whitechapel Snowman begin to suggest connections that are far from coincidental. Moving toward the study door, Holmes paused to deliver one final observation. Sir Reginald, the evidence suggests that your ring's disappearance was accomplished through considerably more sophisticated means than a simple burglary. Someone with intimate knowledge of your habits, access to your premises, and the technical skill to duplicate your key appears to have orchestrated this remarkable theft. As we prepared to depart for Whitechapel, I found myself marvelling once again at my friend's extraordinary ability to extract meaningful patterns from seemingly disparate clues. The blue wax, the pumice powder, the missing handkerchief, and the Pemberton connection were clearly forming a coherent picture in Holmes's brilliant mind, though the complete design remained tantalizingly beyond my own comprehension. The journey from the refined elegance of Belgravia to the bustling streets of Whitechapel provided a stark illustration of London's dramatic social divisions. Our hansom cab carried us through increasingly modest neighbourhoods where the pristine snow that had appeared so picturesque in Sir Reginald's district had been transformed into grey slush by countless boots and cartwheels. The very air seemed heavier here, thick with coal smoke and the mingled odours of industry and daily survival that characterised London's working-class districts. Holmes maintained his characteristic silence during our passage, though I observed his keen eyes cataloguing every detail of our changing surroundings with that methodical precision I had learned to associate with his most productive periods of observation. Inspector Lestrade consulted his notes periodically, clearly attempting to organize the growing complexity of our investigation into some coherent pattern. Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house proved to be a narrow, three-story building whose weathered brick facade spoke of decades enduring London's harsh climate. Despite its modest circumstances, the structure showed clear evidence of careful maintenance. Clean windows, a freshly painted front door, and a small garden that, even in its winter dormancy, reflected the attention of someone who took genuine pride in her establishment. Mrs. Pemberton herself answered our knock, a woman of middle years whose careworn features could not entirely conceal what had once been considerable beauty. Her grey hair was neatly arranged despite the early hour, and her simple but spotlessly clean clothing reflected the same attention to respectability evident in her building's appearance. Upon Inspector Lestrade's introduction, her expression shifted from polite curiosity to unmistakable anxiety. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had known better circumstances, "I cannot imagine what interest Scotland Yard might have in my humble establishment." Holmes stepped forward with his most reassuring manner. Mrs. Pemberton, we are investigating a most peculiar incident involving a valuable ring discovered within one of the snowmen in your garden. We understand that local children built these structures several days ago." "Indeed they did," she replied, leading us into a modest but spotlessly clean parlour. "The children from the neighbourhood often play in our garden during the winter months. Little Tom and Daisy Fletcher from 2 streets over, young Elsie Morrison and several others. I encourage such activities as it keeps them occupied and away from the street's more dangerous diversions." Holmes settled into the offered chair with evident interest. "Most commendable. And you observed their construction activities, personally?" Mrs. Pemberton nodded, her fingers worrying the fabric of her worn but well-maintained skirt. "I watched from my kitchen window as they worked on the afternoon of January 11th. They seemed to be having great fun, though I noticed something rather peculiar about their methods." "In what manner peculiar?" Holmes inquired, his grey eyes sharpening with that intensity that indicated significant information was forthcoming. "They were quite particular about the snow they selected, insisting upon using only the freshest accumulation from the far corner of the garden, near the old elm tree. They rejected several piles that had been there since the storm's beginning, claiming it was too dirty for their purposes. Most unusual behaviour for children, who are typically less discriminating in such matters." Holmes rose and moved toward the window that provided a view of the garden in question. "An excellent vantage point for observation. Might we examine the site where this remarkable discovery was made?" The small enclosed garden revealed the melting remains of several snowmen in various stages of collapse. The largest, clearly the one in question, stood near a withered rose bush, its form now reduced to a slumped mound of greyish snow, surrounded by churned mud bearing the imprints of many small feet. Holmes immediately dropped to one knee beside the collapsed structure, ignoring the dampness that would surely stain his trousers. His magnifying glass revealed details invisible to casual observation, a curious smoothness running through the fractured remains like an internal channel, its walls bearing a glassy quality that suggested they had been subjected to heat. "Most illuminating," he murmured, producing his penknife to scrape a sample from the glazed surface. "Tallow, Watson, and the faintest suggestion of lamp oil." He indicated a broom propped against the garden wall, its handle blackened and slick with congealed fat. "The implement used to create this cavity, unless I am much mistaken." Moving methodically around the site, Holmes examined the footprints preserved in the mud with scientific precision. "Observe, Watson, while most of these impressions are clearly those of children, note these deeper marks here, suggesting a weight considerably greater than that of a young person. The stride pattern indicates an adult moving with deliberate caution." Inspector Lestrade peered at the faint impressions with growing interest. "Someone else was present during the construction?" "The evidence strongly suggests such a conclusion," Holmes confirmed, his attention now drawn to the rosebush itself. Running his fingers along a lower branch, he paused at a point where the bark showed signs of recent abrasion. "This branch has been used as a temporary resting place for some object. Note how the bark is worn smooth in this precise location." Mrs. Pemberton, who had watched this examination with increasing anxiety, cleared her throat hesitantly. "There was something else, Mr. Holmes. Young Tom mentioned that a lady had spoken to him near the omnibus stop that morning, a pretty lady who had asked him to perform some task as part of a game, promising him a shilling for his cooperation." Holmes straightened with evident satisfaction. "Indeed? And might we speak with young Tom directly?" "He should be at the corner bakery at this hour, hoping to earn a penny sweeping the front steps. Mr. Hartwell has a kind heart for hungry children." Before departing to locate this crucial witness, Holmes conducted one final examination of the snowman's remains. His lens revealed fragments of blue, sealing wax embedded in the compacted snow, along with traces of the same crystalline salt residue we had observed in Sir Reginald's study. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe how the snow has melted in distinct layers. The outer portions, exposed to air and sunlight, have naturally thawed first, but notice how the interior maintains its structure considerably longer. Someone with knowledge of such properties might reasonably expect a carefully wrapped object to remain protected within such an environment for several days." As we prepared to seek out young Tom Fletcher, I found myself marveling once again at my friend's extraordinary ability to extract meaningful patterns from seemingly disparate evidence. The glazed channel, the adult footprints, the mysterious lady, and the blue wax fragments were clearly forming a coherent picture in Holmes's brilliant mind, though the complete design remained tantalizingly beyond my own comprehension. We were dealing with someone who possessed not only intimate knowledge of both Sir Reginald's habits and the Whitechapel neighbourhood, but also the technical skill and foresight to orchestrate an elaborate deception spanning the vast social and geographical distances of London's sprawling metropolis. Young Tom Fletcher proved to be precisely where Mrs. Pemberton had indicated, a bright-eyed lad of perhaps 8 years, industriously sweeping the front steps of Hartwell's bakery with a determination that spoke eloquently of his family's modest circumstances. His small figure was nearly dwarfed by the worn broom he wielded, yet he attacked his task with the methodical precision of someone who understood that honest labour, however humble, provided the foundation for survival in London's unforgiving streets. Mr. Hartwell himself emerged from the aromatic warmth of his establishment as we approached, his flour-dusted apron and paternal manner immediately establishing him as one of those neighbourhood figures who served as unofficial guardians for the district's children. "Tom's a good lad, gentlemen," he announced without prompting. "Honest as the day is long and twice as reliable as most adults I could name." Holmes approached the boy with that particular gentleness he reserved for children and those whom circumstances had treated harshly. "Master Fletcher, I presume? We are investigating a most curious matter involving the snowman you helped construct in Mrs. Pemberton's garden, and we believe you might possess information that could prove invaluable to our inquiry." Tom's eyes widened at the sight of Inspector Lestrade's official bearing, but Holmes's reassuring manner quickly dispelled any apprehension. The boy straightened with evident pride at being consulted in such an important matter. "We understand that a lady spoke with you near the omnibus stop on the morning of January 11th, Holmes continued, settling into a crouch that brought him to the child's eye level. "Can you tell us about this encounter?" Tom's face brightened with the memory. "Oh, yes, sir. She was ever so kind, a real lady she was, with proper speech and fine clothes. Wore a grey cloak with silver fastenings and a blue hat with a feather that bobbed when she talked. She smelled lovely too, like violets and that powdery smell you get in bookshops." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "Most observant. And what did this lady request of you?" "She said she was playing a special game with her employer," Tom recounted, his young voice filled with remembered excitement. "Something about hiding a surprise in a snowman for him to find later. She called it a magic charm that would make the snowman extra special." "Did she provide you with any implements for this task?" Holmes inquired, his tone carefully neutral. Tom nodded vigorously. "She gave me a metal rod, like a poker from a fireplace, but thinner and longer, told me to heat it proper hot over a fire, then push it right through the middle of the snowman from top to bottom, wiggling it about to make a nice big hole." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Lestrade. The heated metal technique would indeed create the glazed cavity we had observed in the Snowman's remains, a channel that would protect any object placed within it from the surrounding moisture while the snow gradually compacted around it. "And you followed these instructions precisely?" Holmes asked. "Yes, sir." She made it sound like the grandest adventure, said if I did it just right and kept it secret for a few days, she'd give me a whole shilling. Tom patted his pocket proudly. She waited until the other children went home for their tea, then came back with a little bundle wrapped in something shiny, like silk, but stiffer somehow, lowered it down careful-like on a bit of string, then packed fresh snow around the hole so nobody could tell it had been disturbed. Mr. Hartwell stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "I can vouch for the boy's timeline, gentlemen. Tom was here sweeping until nearly 10:30 that morning, and I did observe a lady in a grey cloak speaking with him near the omnibus stop around 11 o'clock. Later that evening, must have been near 9, I noticed a hansom cab slow by the lane behind Mrs. Pemberton's, though I couldn't swear it actually stopped." Holmes rose gracefully, his mind clearly processing these revelations with characteristic precision. "Tom, this lady's appearance, beyond her clothing, what else did you observe? Her manner of speech, her hands, anything that made an impression?" Tom's brow furrowed with concentration. "She spoke like a proper toff, sir, but not snooty-like. Used fancy words, called the tree an elm, and the snow fresh accumulation, like a schoolmaster might. Her boots were far too fine for walking these streets, polished leather with little buttons up the sides. Not the sort a lady would choose for tramping through Whitechapel snow, if you take my meaning." Holmes produced a coin from his waistcoat, pressing it into Tom's eager palm. "Your assistance has been invaluable, young man. Your powers of observation would do credit to Scotland Yard itself." As we made our way back toward Mrs. Pemberton's boarding house, Holmes maintained that thoughtful silence I had learned to associate with his most productive periods of deduction. The evidence was forming a coherent pattern, a young woman of evident refinement and education, possessing intimate knowledge of both Sir Reginald's habits and the Whitechapel neighbourhood, who had orchestrated an elaborate deception involving the manipulation of innocent children and the careful exploitation of seasonal weather patterns. "The methodology becomes clear," Holmes observed as we approached the boarding house. Our perpetrator required a secure hiding place that would preserve the ring while simultaneously creating the appearance of supernatural intervention. The heated rod technique ensured the cavity would remain stable, while the child's innocent cooperation provided the perfect cover for the operation. Inspector Lestrade consulted his notebook with evident satisfaction. "The timeline fits perfectly, Holmes. Miss Clara Pemberton departed Sir Reginald's study at 4 o'clock, providing ample time to reach Whitechapel and implement this remarkable scheme." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "Yet we must consider the theatrical nature of this crime. Why employ such an elaborate method when simple theft might have sufficed? The use of the Snowman suggests either a desire to delay discovery or perhaps to create the appearance of an impossible occurrence, a mystery so bizarre it would defy logical explanation." We found Mrs. Pemberton awaiting our return with barely concealed anxiety, her hands trembling slightly as she served tea in her modest parlour. Her eyes darted frequently toward the garden window, and I observed how her composure seemed to crumble with each passing moment. "Mrs. Pemberton," Holmes began gently, "I believe the time has come for complete honesty regarding recent events. The evidence we have gathered suggests a carefully orchestrated deception that required considerable planning and intimate knowledge of both Sir Reginald Ashworth's habits and your neighbourhood's characteristics." The woman's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. "Oh, Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her voice breaking with suppressed emotion, "I feared this moment would come. Something has been troubling Clara terribly these past weeks. She's been so secretive, so anxious about matters she refuses to discuss. But surely you cannot believe my daughter capable of theft?" Holmes leaned forward with his most reassuring manner. "Madam, we seek only the truth, wherever it may lead. Your daughter's position as Sir Reginald's secretary, combined with her familial connection to this establishment, places her in a unique position to have orchestrated the events we have observed. However, the complete picture remains unclear, and we must proceed with both caution and thoroughness." The shadows were lengthening in the small parlour as the winter afternoon drew toward its close, and I sensed that we stood on the threshold of revelations that would illuminate not only the method of this impossible crime, but also the deeper motivations that had driven someone to such extraordinary lengths. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, and the next moves in this intricate chess match would prove decisive in unravelling one of the most ingenious deceptions we had ever encountered. Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally crumbled entirely, and she buried her face in her hands as the weight of her daughter's precarious situation became fully apparent. The modest parlour, with its carefully maintained respectability, seemed to shrink around us as the implications of our investigation pressed inward, like the gathering winter darkness beyond the frost-covered windows. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered through her tears, "Clara has been so troubled these past weeks. She speaks little of her work with Sir Reginald, but I sense there are difficulties she dare not share. She was dismissed 3 days ago, dismissed without reference or explanation, and she fears she will never find respectable employment again." Holmes leaned forward with that particular gentleness he reserved for those whom circumstance had treated harshly. "Mrs. Pemberton, I require your complete honesty if we are to help your daughter. Does Clara maintain any personal effects here, or has she removed everything to her Bloomsbury lodgings?" "She keeps a small trunk in her childhood room," the woman replied, gesturing toward the narrow staircase. "She comes here when the city becomes too overwhelming, seeking the comfort of familiar surroundings. The room remains exactly as she left it after her father's death." Holmes rose with evident purpose. "With your permission, we must examine these belongings. The physical evidence may illuminate aspects of this case that remain obscured by assumption and conjecture." The small chamber under the eaves spoke eloquently of a young woman caught between two worlds, the scholarly aspirations evident in the neat stack of books on Byzantine art and medieval manuscripts, and the practical necessities reflected in the simple, well-mended clothing hanging from wooden pegs. Holmes immediately gravitated toward a small wooden trunk positioned beneath the single window, its brass fittings green with age. "Inspector Lestrade," he called softly, "observe the lock mechanism on this trunk. Note the minute scratches around the keyhole, fresh ones suggesting recent and perhaps hurried access. Inside the trunk, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay an assortment of delicate tools that spoke immediately of specialized craftsmanship." Holmes lifted each implement with reverent care: tiny hammers, precision files, a collection of punches and chasing tools, and several instruments whose specific purpose I could not immediately determine. "A jeweler's kit," I observed, recognizing some of the more common implements from my medical training's exposure to fine surgical instruments. "Indeed, Watson, and of exceptional quality," Holmes confirmed, examining a small engraving tool under his magnifying glass. "These belong to a master craftsman. Note the wear patterns that speak of decades of skilled use, and the initials HP engraved in the handles." Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried a note of pride despite her distress. "Henry Pemberton, Clara's father. He was among London's finest jewellers before consumption took him 5 years ago. Clara learned at his side from childhood, displaying a natural aptitude that might have led to a distinguished career had circumstances permitted. Holmes continued his methodical examination, discovering beneath the tools a small leather pouch containing fragments of sealing wax in various colors, including several sticks of the distinctive blue we had observed in Sir Reginald's study. More significantly, he withdrew a delicate brass instrument that I recognized as a jeweler's loop of exceptional magnification. This loop bears the same initials, Holmes noted, yet observe how the brass mounting shows signs of recent polishing, and the lens itself has been cleaned with unusual care. Someone has been using these tools quite recently, and with considerable precision. Moving to examine the small writing, table positioned near the window, Holmes discovered what appeared to be practice sheets, pages covered with careful reproductions of various monogram designs executed in different colored inks and waxes. Among them, rendered with particular attention to detail, were several examples of Sir Reginald's distinctive monogram in gold thread. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, holding one sheet to the light. The progression here suggests someone studying the precise formation of these letters, not for forgery necessarily, but for perfect reproduction. Note how the later attempts achieve an exactness that would fool all but the most careful examination. Inspector Lestrade, who had been cataloguing each discovery with growing excitement, looked up from his notebook. "Surely this confirms Miss Pemberton's guilt, Holmes. The tools, the practice sheets, the sealing wax, the evidence is overwhelming." Holmes straightened slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. "The evidence is certainly suggestive, Inspector, yet consider the psychological profile we are constructing. A young woman of evident intelligence and refined education, possessing the technical skills necessary for sophisticated deception, yet also displaying the methodical precision of someone who leaves detailed records of her activities. Does this suggest criminal intent or perhaps something far more complex?" Moving to the window, Holmes examined the view it provided of the small garden below, the same garden where the Snowman had been constructed with such careful attention to the selection of pristine snow. His keen eyes traced the sight lines, calculating angles and distances with the precision of a surveyor. "From this vantage point," he observed, "one could observe the entire construction process while remaining undetected. Yet why would someone with the skills to execute such an elaborate deception choose to remain so close to the scene of discovery? Unless, Watson, the proximity itself serves a specific purpose we have yet to comprehend." Mrs. Pemberton had followed us upstairs and now stood in the doorway, her anxiety evident in every line of her careworn face. "Mr. Holmes, whatever Clara may have done, I beg you to remember that she is a good girl who has known only hardship since her father's death. If she has made poor choices, surely desperation rather than malice drove her to them." Holmes turned from the window with an expression that combined sympathy with unwavering determination. "Mrs. Pemberton, the evidence suggests your daughter possesses both the means and opportunity to have orchestrated the events we have observed. Yet the elaborate nature of the deception, combined with certain inconsistencies in the timeline, suggests the possibility of coercion or manipulation by parties yet unknown." As we prepared to depart for Clara's Bloomsbury lodgings, Holmes paused at the threshold of the small room, his brilliant mind clearly processing the complex web of evidence we had uncovered. The jeweler's tools, the practice sheets, the strategic positioning of the room, all pointed toward Clara Pemberton's involvement, yet something in the methodical precision of the evidence itself suggested a deeper game being played by minds more cunning than a desperate young woman seeking to escape financial ruin. "Watson," he said quietly as we descended the narrow stair, "we are dealing with a case that challenges our fundamental assumptions about motive and method. The physical evidence appears overwhelming, Yet I cannot escape the feeling that we are observing the carefully constructed facade of a more complex deception, one that requires not only technical skill but also an intimate understanding of human psychology and the predictable responses of official investigation. The winter evening had settled over Whitechapel with its characteristic blend of industrial smoke and domestic warmth as we emerged onto the narrow street. Yet I sensed that our investigation had reached a critical juncture where the accumulation of evidence would soon demand direct confrontation with the central figure in this remarkable mystery. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, and the next moves would prove decisive in determining whether Clara Pemberton was a criminal mastermind or merely another victim in a web of deception that stretched far beyond the humble confines of her mother's boarding house. The fog-shrouded squares of Bloomsbury received us with that peculiar hush characteristic of London's academic quarter, where scholarly pursuits seem to muffle even the harsh realities of winter weather. As our hansom navigated the familiar streets lined with respectable lodging-houses, Holmes broke his contemplative silence with an observation that had clearly been forming during our journey from Whitechapel. "Watson," he said, his grey eyes reflecting the passing gaslight, "consider the theatrical nature of this entire affair. A priceless gem vanishes from a locked study, only to reappear within a child's Snowman, the very stuff of sensation novels. Yet the methodical precision required suggests a mind that understands not merely the mechanics of deception, but also the psychology of investigation. Our perpetrator anticipated exactly how official inquiry would proceed, laying a trail of evidence so obvious as to be almost insulting to professional competence. Clara Pemberton's lodgings proved to be in a narrow Georgian house on Gower Street, whose brass nameplate identified Mrs. Whitmore as proprietress. This worthy lady, a woman of evident respectability, whose protective manner toward her tenants immediately established her character, greeted Inspector Lestrade's inquiry with visible concern. "Miss Pemberton has been most distressed these past days," she confided, as she led us up the carpeted stair. "Scarcely eating, receiving visitors at unusual hours, and I've observed her pacing her room. Well into the night, yesterday evening, a distinguished gentleman called upon her after 9 o'clock, most irregular for a young lady of her station." Holmes paused on the landing, his attention immediately sharpening. "This gentleman's appearance, Mrs. Whitmore?" Silver-haired, expensively dressed with the bearing of authority. Yet something in his manner struck me as agitated, not the composed demeanour one would expect from a person of his evident station. The modest chamber we entered reflected Clara Pemberton's circumstances with painful clarity. Scholarly texts on medieval art and manuscript illumination occupied every available surface, while her few possessions showed the careful maintenance of someone for whom replacement would prove difficult. Holmes immediately gravitated toward a small writing desk positioned near the window, its surface bearing evidence of recent intensive use. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, indicating several sheets of paper covered with what appeared to be draft correspondence. The handwriting showed progressive deterioration from precise formation to increasingly erratic strokes, suggesting composition under considerable emotional strain. Using his magnifying glass, Holmes examined the fragmentary texts with scientific precision. "Multiple attempts at formal communication," he noted, "yet none reaches completion. Note this phrase, 'circumstances beyond my control compel,' and here the burden of deception has become. The language suggests moral conflict rather than criminal calculation." Our examination was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps, followed by Mrs. Whitmore's voice, raised in evident surprise. "Miss Pemberton, we were not expecting your return this evening." The young woman who appeared in the doorway possessed that refined beauty which education and character lend to naturally pleasant features. Clara Pemberton was perhaps 25, with intelligent dark eyes and a composure that, while currently strained, spoke of considerable inner strength. Her clothing, though simple, was impeccably maintained, and her bearing reflected the dignity of someone determined to preserve respectability despite reduced circumstances. Upon observing Inspector Lestrade's official presence, she straightened with visible resolve. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clear despite evident tension, "I have been expecting this interview since learning of your inquiries at my mother's establishment." Holmes stepped forward with his most reassuring manner. "Miss Pemberton, we are investigating the remarkable circumstances surrounding the Star of Kashmir's disappearance and recovery. While certain evidence suggests your involvement, we seek only the truth, however complex it may prove." Clara moved into the room with careful precision, settling into the single chair with evident relief. "The truth, Mr. Holmes, is considerably more complicated than the obvious interpretation of evidence might suggest. I have indeed been manipulated into actions I deeply regret, though not in the manner you might assume." Before Holmes could respond, a sharp rap upon the street door announced another arrival. Mrs. Whitmore's voice, raised in evident confusion, was followed by rapid footsteps upon the stair. A young messenger appeared, breathless from his urgent errand, bearing a sealed envelope. "For Miss Pemberton," he announced, glancing nervously at our assembly. "Lady said it were most urgent, sir." Clara's hands trembled as she broke the blue wax seal, and I detected the faint scent of violets as she unfolded the paper. Her complexion grew noticeably paler as she read, then wordlessly passed the note to Holmes. "Say nothing of the heated rod, nor of the monogram practice, nor of the late visitor. Your mother's safety depends upon your continued silence. Speak truthfully to the detective, and both you and she will suffer consequences beyond your imagination." Holmes examined the paper with his lens, noting the expensive watermark and the impression of what appeared to be a signet ring. "Factory-made ink, superior paper stock, and a cipher rather than a proper seal," he observed grimly. "Miss Pemberton, it appears that someone with considerable resources and detailed knowledge of our investigation is most anxious to control your testimony." Clara's composure finally wavered as the full implications of her situation became apparent. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "I fear I have become entangled in circumstances far beyond my understanding, circumstances that place not only myself but my mother in terrible danger." Holmes settled into the chair opposite Clara with that particular gentleness he reserved for those whom circumstances had treated harshly, while Inspector Lestrade positioned himself near the door, his official bearing softened by evident sympathy for the young woman's distress. The modest room seemed to contract around us as the weight of impending revelations pressed inward like the gathering winter darkness beyond the frost-covered windows. "Miss Pemberton," Holmes began, his voice carrying both authority and compassion, "the threats contained in this note confirm my suspicions that you are not the architect of this deception, but rather its most carefully selected victim. However, your complete honesty now represents our best opportunity to protect both yourself and your mother from whatever forces have orchestrated these remarkable events." Clara drew a shuddering breath, her composure wavering between fear and desperate resolve. 3 weeks ago, Sir Reginald dismissed me without explanation or reference, claiming my work had become unsatisfactory despite providing no specific instances of failure. I was devastated. My position represented not merely employment, but my sole means of supporting my mother's establishment and her declining health. She rose with visible effort and moved to her writing desk, withdrawing a small leather portfolio from its locked drawer. That evening, As I walked through Russell Square attempting to compose myself, a distinguished gentleman approached me. Silver-haired, expensively dressed, with the bearing of one accustomed to obedience, exactly as Mrs. Whitmore described. He claimed to represent certain parties who had observed my situation with sympathy. Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. This gentleman's specific proposal? He offered substantial compensation and the restoration of my position with Sir Reginald in exchange for what he termed a harmless deception, a scholarly prank that would embarrass Sir Reginald without causing permanent damage. He knew of my father's reputation as a jeweller, of the skills I had inherited, and most disturbingly the precise details of our financial difficulties. Clara's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He provided blue sealing wax, pumice powder, and detailed instructions for creating a key impression. He assured me repeatedly that no genuine theft would occur, that the ring would be safely returned within days, and Sir Reginald would suffer nothing more than temporary confusion and mild embarrassment. The Snowman deception was entirely his conception, Holmes inquired, his grey eyes sharpening with that intensity I had learned to associate with significant deductions. Completely. He described it as the perfect, impossible hiding place, something that would baffle everyone while creating the appearance of supernatural intervention. He coached me on precisely what to say to the children, how to use the heated rod technique to create the cavity, and even specified the location near my mother's establishment to create a connection that would raise suspicion without providing conclusive proof. Holmes had been examining the threatening note during this recitation, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to casual observation. The watermark bears the insignia of Harrods, he noted quietly. The same establishment where Sir Reginald commissioned his monogrammed handkerchiefs, most suggestive, and observed this partial impression in the wax, not a proper signet, but rather the edge of a coin or medallion pressed into service as an improvised seal. Our examination was suddenly interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps upon the stair, followed by Mrs. Whitmore's breathless arrival with a telegram clutched in her trembling hand. From Scotland Yard, Inspector, an urgent runner brought it not 5 minutes ago. Inspector Lestrade tore open the yellow envelope, his ruddy complexion blanching as he read the contents. "Holmes," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Sir Reginald's jeweller has examined the recovered ring. The setting is genuine, but the stone itself is paste, expertly crafted, but worthless." The silence that followed was so profound that even the hiss of the street's gas lamps seemed unnaturally loud. Holmes's lean figure grew very still, like a blade drawn and held ready for action. "As I suspected," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. The Snowman served not to conceal the prize, but to return a worthless substitute, a theatrical discovery designed to quiet alarm, while the genuine Star of Kashmir travelled by an entirely different route. "Miss Pemberton, you have been manipulated with consummate skill, used to facilitate not theft, but the perfect misdirection." Clara's face crumpled with the full realization of her situation. "Then I have been party to genuine theft while believing myself involved in harmless mischief. My God, what have I done?" Holmes moved to the window, his keen eyes scanning the darkened street below with professional intensity. "You have been the victim of a criminal mind that anticipated exactly how official investigation would proceed, laying evidence that would implicate you while concealing the true perpetrator's involvement. Observe, Watson, that hansom at the corner has maintained its position far too long for legitimate passenger service." Moving back to Clara's side, Holmes continued with renewed urgency. Miss Pemberton, the individual orchestrating these events possesses resources sufficient to maintain surveillance, coordinate multiple operatives, and execute a deception of remarkable sophistication. This suggests involvement by parties with considerable influence and financial means. Inspector Lestrade consulted his notebook with growing determination. "What are your instructions, Holmes?" "First, dispatch trustworthy men in plain clothes to Mrs. Pemberton's establishment immediately. They must remain within sight but unobserved. Second, ensure that the paste ring is secured at Scotland Yard, not in Sir Reginald's possession. Most importantly, do not advertise the discovery of the substitution. Our adversary must believe us still dazzled by the Snowman's impossible mystery." Holmes turned to Clara with that combination of sympathy and unwavering resolve that characterized his approach to those caught in circumstances beyond their control. "Miss Pemberton, you will compose a brief note to this mysterious gentleman, requesting an urgent meeting tonight at 9 o'clock to discuss final assurances regarding our arrangement. Phrase it naturally as you would in your ordinary correspondence." "And if he comes?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. "Then we shall discover whether our theatrical criminal prefers to remain behind the curtain or step forward to take his bow," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with that particular intensity that indicated the game had reached its most critical phase. The author of this elaborate deception has played his hand with remarkable skill, yet in threatening you directly he has revealed both his continued presence in London and his anxiety about our investigation's progress. As Clara bent to compose the requested message, I observed Holmes's methodical preparation for what promised to be a confrontation that would test not only his legendary deductive powers but also our ability to protect an innocent young woman who had become an unwitting pawn in a criminal enterprise of far greater scope and sophistication than any of us had initially imagined. The winter fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and I sensed that the next few hours would prove decisive in unraveling one of the most ingenious deceptions we had ever encountered. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was indeed afoot, and our adversary was about to discover that his carefully orchestrated symphony of misdirection had struck one discordant note too many. Clara's hand trembled only slightly as she composed the requested message under Holmes's watchful guidance, her elegant script maintaining its practiced precision despite the gravity of our circumstances. The note struck precisely the tone Holmes had specified, urgent yet deferential, suggesting anxiety about their arrangement without betraying any hint of our presence or the true nature of our investigation. "Excellent, Miss Pemberton," Holmes murmured, examining the completed missive with his magnifying glass to ensure no telltale impressions or irregularities might alert our quarry to deception. The casual observer would detect nothing amiss, yet the underlying urgency should compel immediate response. The intervening hours were devoted to meticulous preparation that reflected Holmes's understanding of criminal psychology and tactical necessity. Inspector Lestrade positioned his two most reliable constables in Mrs. Whitmore's adjacent parlour, their presence concealed behind a partially open door that provided clear sightlines while remaining invisible to casual observation. Holmes and I selected positions within Clara's chamber itself, he behind the heavy curtains that framed the single window, myself within the depths of a substantial wardrobe whose velvet drapes provided adequate concealment while allowing observation through a carefully arranged gap. "Our adversary will undoubtedly scan the room for signs of ambush," Holmes explained in whispered tones as we settled into our respective positions. "His survival thus far depends upon such caution. However, his arrogance and desire to maintain control over Miss Pemberton will ultimately override his natural wariness." Clara, following Holmes's precise instructions, arranged herself at her writing desk with papers scattered naturally about, creating the impression of someone engaged in ordinary correspondence rather than participating in an elaborate trap. Despite her evident nervousness, she maintained that composed bearing, which had originally recommended her to Sir Reginald's attention, a quality that would prove essential in the performance now required of her. The appointed hour approached with agonizing deliberation, marked only by the steady rhythm of Mrs. Whitmore's mantel clock and the occasional settling sounds that characterized these older London buildings. Holmes had cautioned absolute silence and patience, emphasizing that our adversary might arrive early to observe the premises or might send an agent rather than appearing personally. At precisely 9 o'clock, the soft sound of measured footsteps upon the carpeted stair announced the arrival of our quarry. The gentleman who entered possessed exactly the distinguished appearance Clara had described: silver hair immaculately groomed, clothing of obvious quality, and the bearing of one accustomed to deference and obedience. Yet from my concealed vantage point, I observed what Clara's previous distressed state had prevented her from noting: the slight tremor in his hands, suggesting recent nervous strain, and the way his pale eyes darted constantly about the room, cataloguing potential threats with the wariness of a hunted creature. "My dear Miss Pemberton," he said, his cultured voice carrying just the faintest trace of anxiety beneath its surface confidence, "I trust our recent correspondence has not caused you undue alarm. These delicate matters require careful handling, as I'm certain you understand." Clara gestured toward the chair opposite her desk with admirable composure. "Please be seated, sir. Your note this afternoon suggested some urgency regarding our arrangement." The gentleman settled himself with evident relief, clearly believing himself in complete control of the situation. "Indeed, the official investigation has proceeded exactly as anticipated, focusing entirely upon the theatrical aspects of our little deception, while missing the essential point entirely. However, recent developments require our immediate attention." I observed Holmes's slight movement behind the curtains as our adversary began the psychological assessment we had anticipated. The criminal's next words carried a subtle test designed to gauge Clara's continued reliability and discretion. "The detective Holmes has acquired a reputation for unusual persistence," he observed carefully, his pale eyes studying Clara's face for any sign of deception. "I trust he has not pressed you with questions beyond the scope of your actual knowledge?" Clara's response demonstrated the intelligence that had originally qualified her for scholarly employment. "Mr. Holmes appears fascinated by the mechanical aspects of the Snowman deception, but seems to regard me as merely another witness rather than a potential suspect. His questions focused primarily upon the children's activities and the physical evidence at the scene." The gentleman's visible relaxation at this news confirmed Holmes's psychological assessment. Brilliant in conception and execution, yet fundamentally anxious about maintaining control over the multiple elements of his elaborate scheme. "Excellent," he murmured, withdrawing a leather portfolio from his coat. "Then we may proceed to the final phase of our arrangement. The genuine star of Kashmir has been safely transported to continental buyers who appreciate such treasures without concerning themselves with tedious questions of provenance. Your role in facilitating this transfer has earned you not only the promised compensation, but also my assurance that your position with Sir Reginald will be restored within the week." Clara leaned forward with carefully feigned eagerness. "And my mother's safety?" "Your note suggested that her welfare depended upon my continued silence." "A precautionary measure only," the gentleman assured her, though his eyes hardened noticeably. "Provided you maintain absolute discretion regarding our association, neither you nor your mother will experience any difficulties. However, should you feel compelled to share details of our arrangement with the authorities—" He allowed the threat to hang unfinished in the air, its implications unmistakable despite the civilized language. This moment of criminal arrogance was precisely what Holmes had anticipated, recognizing that success would eventually overcome caution, compelling our adversary to reveal both his methods and his continued presence in London. Opening his portfolio, the gentleman revealed not only a substantial sum in banknotes, but also what appeared to be a formal letter bearing an impressive seal. "Your reinstatement to Sir Reginald's employ," he explained, "along with a glowing reference that will ensure your professional reputation remains unmarred by recent events." Clara reached for the documents with apparent gratitude, yet I observed how her hand trembled slightly, not with relief but with the nervous energy of someone prepared to execute a carefully rehearsed action. Holmes had coached her extensively on this crucial moment, emphasizing that our adversary's guard would be lowest when he believed himself most successful. "There is one detail that continues to trouble me," Clara said, her voice carrying just the right note of innocent curiosity. "The heated rod technique you described, how did you come to know such an unusual method?" The gentleman's smile carried a note of professional pride that would prove his undoing. "My dear young lady, one does not orchestrate such elaborate deceptions without considerable study of specialized techniques. The glazing effect produced by heated metal through compacted snow is well documented in certain geological texts, though I suspect few individuals have thought to apply such knowledge practically." This revelation of specialized academic knowledge provided the final confirmation Holmes required. Our adversary had revealed not only his continued presence in London, but also his scholarly background, information that, combined with our previous observations, would prove decisive in his identification. Holmes chose this moment to emerge from his concealment with the fluid grace of a predator who had patiently awaited the perfect opportunity to strike. "Professor Morrison," he said, quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "your expertise in geological mineralogy has served you admirably in criminal enterprise, though perhaps not as wisely as you might have hoped." The transformation in our adversary's demeanor was instantaneous and complete. The cultured gentleman vanished, replaced by a cornered creature whose eyes darted desperately about the room, calculating distances and possibilities with the frantic energy of someone who suddenly understood that his elaborate game had reached its inexorable conclusion. "Your familiarity with the properties of heated metal and compacted snow," Holmes continued with inexorable logic, "combined with your access to Sir Reginald's social circle through the Royal Geological Society, provided both the technical knowledge and social opportunity necessary for this remarkable deception. The pumice powder in Sir Reginald's study, ostensibly for manuscript restoration, served the dual purpose of creating precise key impressions, a technique well known to those who study crystalline structures and their practical applications." Inspector Lestrade emerged from the adjoining chamber with official authority, while I stepped forward from my concealment, my service revolver drawn and ready. The net had closed around Professor Morrison with the inexorable precision that characterized Holmes's most successful investigations, yet I sensed that our adversary possessed both the resources and desperation to make his final capture far from certain. The concluding act of this remarkable drama was about to commence, and the stakes had never been higher for all concerned. Professor Morrison's transformation was instantaneous and complete, the distinguished academic facade crumbling to reveal the desperate creature beneath. His pale eyes darted frantically between the faces surrounding him, calculating distances and possibilities with the frantic energy of a cornered animal who suddenly comprehended that his elaborate game had reached its inexorable conclusion. "This is preposterous," he stammered, his cultured voice cracking under the strain. "Baseless accusations built upon coincidence and supposition. I sought merely to assist Miss Pemberton in a delicate scholarly matter, nothing more." Holmes stepped closer, his grey eyes reflecting that implacable certainty I had witnessed in countless similar moments. "Professor Aldrich Morrison of the Royal Geological Society," he continued with methodical precision, "your expertise in crystalline formation and thermal conductivity provided not merely the technical knowledge for this deception, but also the academic credentials that granted you access to Sir Reginald's private study during those monthly society meetings he hosts for fellow scholars." Morrison's hand trembled as he reached instinctively toward his waistcoat pocket, but the sight of my service revolver discouraged any precipitous action. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, betraying the physiological stress of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing with mathematical inevitability. "Your financial difficulties became acute following disastrous speculation in South African mining ventures," Holmes observed, settling into his characteristic analytical rhythm. "Investments that promised to capitalize on your geological expertise, but instead consumed your inherited fortune, leaving you desperate for alternative sources of income. The Star of Kashmir represented not merely a valuable prize, but salvation from complete ruin." Clara remained motionless at her writing desk, her composure admirable despite the electric tension crackling through the small room. Her dark eyes reflected a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension as the full scope of her manipulation became clear. "The continental buyers you mentioned represent a sophisticated network, specializing in acquiring valuable objects without concerning themselves with legal ownership," Holmes continued relentlessly. "Your academic reputation provided perfect cover for international correspondence and travel, while your geological expertise granted entree to this criminal enterprise." Morrison's composure finally shattered completely. With a snarl of desperation, he seized the leather portfolio from Clara's desk and hurled it directly at Holmes's face. In the same fluid motion, he lunged toward the door, his scholarly bearing abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. I intercepted him at the threshold, our bodies colliding with sufficient force to jar my teeth against the doorframe. Despite his spare frame, Morrison possessed the wiry strength of desperation, fighting with the ferocity of a man who understood that capture meant complete destruction. We grappled briefly on the narrow landing before his elbow caught my ribs, and he tore free, leaving a scrap of fine wool clutched in my grasp. Holmes, meanwhile, had caught the flung portfolio with reflexive grace, his attention immediately drawn to its scattered contents rather than pursuing our fleeing quarry. "Inspector Lestrade," he called sharply. "The cab at the corner. Prevent its departure at all costs." The sound of Morrison's boots clattering down the narrow stair was followed by Lestrade's heavier pursuit, then the sharp crack of the street door slamming against its frame. Holmes knelt among the portfolio's scattered contents, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to casual observation. "Most illuminating, Watson," he murmured, holding up a folded document bearing foreign watermarks. "A bill of lading from Tilbury docks, cargo declared as mineralogical specimens consigned to Bruckner and Company of Antwerp. Note the sailing schedule marked in Morrison's own hand." He lifted another paper with evident satisfaction. "And here, a receipt from Duclair and Sons of Piccadilly for replacement crystal size and brilliance per specification. The paste reproduction, naturally, crafted to Morrison's exacting requirements." The sound of returning footsteps announced Lestrade's breathless arrival, his face flushed with exertion and frustration. He reached the waiting hansom, Holmes. The driver had the horses moving before I could close the distance. "But observe," he held up a leather glove, expensive and monogrammed. "Morrison lost this in his haste." Holmes examined the glove with his characteristic thoroughness. "Excellent, Inspector. Note the faint residue of pumice powder embedded in the leather, physical evidence linking Morrison directly to the crime scene. More importantly, observe this small tear in the palm and the corresponding stain of blue sealing wax. Clara, who had watched these proceedings with growing amazement, found her voice at last. The blue wax, he used it to create the impression of Sir Reginald's key? Precisely, Miss Pemberton. Your father's jeweller's tools, combined with Morrison's geological knowledge, provided the perfect means for key duplication. The pumice powder served the dual purpose of creating precise impressions while providing plausible explanation for its presence in Sir Reginald's study. Holmes moved to the window, his keen eyes scanning the fog-shrouded street below. "You are all." Morrison's escape was clearly planned, yet his panic suggests he had not anticipated exposure quite so soon. The Tilbury connection provides our next objective. He will attempt to reach his continental associates before official pursuit can be organized. Inspector Lestrade consulted his pocket watch with evident urgency. "The next tide departs Tilbury at dawn, Holmes, if Morrison reaches that vessel." "He shall not," Holmes replied with quiet certainty. "Watson, observe the methodical nature of these documents. Morrison's scholarly habits have served him ill. Every detail of his criminal enterprise recorded with academic precision, the Antwerp connection, the Piccadilly jeweller, even his planned escape route, all documented with the thoroughness of a man who believed himself beyond suspicion." Moving to Clara's side, Holmes spoke with that protective gentleness he reserved for those whom circumstances had treated harshly. "Miss Pemberton, Morrison's manipulation exploited your genuine distress while concealing the true scope of his criminal enterprise. Your cooperation, obtained through deception and maintained through threats, constitutes evidence of his guilt rather than your own." The winter fog pressed against the frost-covered windows like a living thing, and I sensed that our investigation had reached its most critical juncture. Morrison's desperate flight had revealed both his guilt and his continued presence in London, yet his head start and prepared escape route suggested that the final confrontation would require all of Holmes's legendary strategic brilliance. "Inspector," Holmes announced, his voice carrying absolute authority, "dispatch your swiftest men to Tilbury docks immediately. Have them watch for anyone matching Morrison's description, but maintain distance. We must not alert his associates to official interest. Meanwhile, Watson and I shall pay an urgent visit to Duclair and Sons. The jeweller who crafted that paste replica possesses information that may prove decisive in preventing Morrison's escape." As we prepared to venture once more into London's fog-shrouded streets, I reflected upon the remarkable complexity of the case we had unravelled. What had begun as an impossible mystery involving a ring discovered within a child's snowman had revealed itself as an elaborate criminal enterprise orchestrated by one of London's most respected academics. Yet Morrison's flight suggested that the game was far from concluded, and the next few hours would prove whether Holmes's deductive brilliance could triumph over criminal desperation and careful preparation. The hunt for Professor Morrison had begun in earnest, and the stakes had never been higher for all concerned. The establishment of Duclair and Sons occupied a narrow building whose discreet brass nameplate spoke of clientele who valued both quality and absolute discretion. Despite the late hour, the elderly proprietor received us with evident anxiety, his practiced composure cracking under Inspector Lestrade's official scrutiny and Holmes's penetrating gaze. "Professor Morrison commissioned a most unusual piece 3 weeks past," Duclair confirmed, consulting his leather-bound records with trembling fingers. "A sapphire reproduction requiring exact dimensional specifications, not merely appearance, but precise optical properties. Most peculiar for academic purposes, yet his payment was generous and immediate." Holmes leaned forward with that intensity I had learned to associate with crucial revelations. "His specific requirements?" He provided detailed measurements and insisted upon a hollow geode shell of quartz crystal sealed with shellac to create a waterproof cavity. The paste sapphire was to be mounted separately. He claimed the geode was for transporting delicate specimens to continental colleagues. The pieces of Morrison's elaborate puzzle clicked into place with mathematical precision. Holmes's grey eyes blazed with that particular satisfaction reserved for the moment when seemingly impossible circumstances yielded to logical analysis. The perfect concealment, he murmured, a geological specimen that would pass any casual inspection, while the paste reproduction served its theatrical purpose in the Snowman. Watson, we must reach Tilbury immediately. Morrison's head start may prove decisive. The fog-shrouded journey eastward carried us through London's industrial arteries toward the Thames, where the great docks received the commerce of the empire. Our hansom's wheels rang against icy cobblestones as Holmes outlined his strategy with characteristic precision. Morrison will attempt passage on a cargo vessel carrying mineralogical specimen. His academic credentials provide perfect cover for such shipments. Inspector Lestrade's men must maintain distance until he commits the evidence to the ship's custody, ensuring we possess both the criminal and irrefutable proof. Tilbury docks emerged from the winter fog like a scene from Dante's imagination, shadowy figures moving among towering cranes, the mournful cries of gulls, and the acrid smell of coal smoke mingling with salt air. Lestrade's constables, positioned with military precision, signalled our arrival through subtle gestures that betrayed nothing to casual observation. "Pier 7, one murmured as we passed. "Antwerp packet Minerva takes cargo at the tide's turn." Holmes advanced through the maze of crates and machinery with predatory grace, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail. Near the vessel's gangplank, a familiar figure supervised the loading of a substantial wooden case marked Geological Specimens, AM, Fragile. Professor Morrison, his silver hair dishevelled by the river wind, maintained his scholarly bearing despite the nervous energy that betrayed his desperate circumstances. He handed shipping documents to a uniformed officer, glanced anxiously about the fog-shrouded dock, then stepped back as dock workers hefted his precious cargo toward the ship's hold. "Now," Holmes said quietly, and stepped forward with the inexorable authority of justice itself. Morrison's transformation was instantaneous, the distinguished academic facade crumbling to reveal the cornered creature beneath. He clutched desperately at his leather portfolio as Lestrade's men materialized from the fog, their official bearing making resistance futile. "You cannot examine that crate," he protested with fading indignation. "Private property, consular seals, academic privilege." "Scotland Yard and the Crown's authority," Lestrade replied firmly, producing his warrant. "Open it immediately." The wooden case yielded to official scrutiny, revealing within its straw packing a magnificent geode of smoky quartz. Holmes lifted the crystalline sphere with reverent care, noting the hairline seam that marked its artificial division. A heated knife blade, applied with surgical precision, parted the shellac seal with a soft whisper. Within the glittering crystal cavity, nestled like a star fallen to earth, lay the genuine star of Kashmir. Even in the grey dock light, the sapphire blazed with that inner fire that distinguished authentic treasures from their artificial counterparts. "Ingenious," Holmes observed, holding the recovered gem to the light. Morrison's geological expertise enabled him to create the perfect hiding place, a specimen that would pass customs inspection while protecting its precious cargo from moisture and detection. The return to Baker Street found us in contemplative mood, the successful resolution of this remarkable case providing that satisfaction which comes from seeing justice served and innocence protected. Clara Pemberton had been completely vindicated, her mother's boarding house secured from financial ruin, and Morrison's continental criminal network dismantled through his captured correspondence. Holmes settled into his familiar chair with evident contentment, reaching for his violin as dawn broke over London's snow-covered rooftops. "Watson," he observed, tuning the instrument with characteristic precision. "This case demonstrates that even the most elaborate deceptions contain the seeds of their own destruction. Morrison's very expertise, his methodical nature and scholarly habits, ultimately provided the evidence necessary for his conviction. The morning sun, struggling through London's perpetual fog, illuminated our comfortable sitting room as Holmes began one of those haunting melodies that invariably followed his most successful investigations. The case of the ring found inside a snowman had concluded with mathematical precision, yet I reflected that the human elements, Clara's courage, her mother's dignity, and Morrison's tragic fall from academic grace, reminded us that behind every mystery lay the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defined our remarkable partnership in the pursuit of truth. The game, as my friend was fond of saying, would always be afoot, and London's endless capacity for both wonder and wickedness would continue to provide challenges worthy of the world's first consulting detective.